Well, that definitely is a first, and completely remarkable and completely beautiful. And what fun for me to be here. Now I'm a Methodist, so I'm really not supposed to be here on Sunday morning. But this feels like church in all the right kinds of ways, and not just because we've had a wonderful processional and a good hymn already and up and moving, but also because like any church, much of the appeal is the fellowship, and the fellowship of this organization and this movement, now 40 years old, is so palpable and deep and so capable of welcoming in every year new people and yet celebrating the old. And just to look down the list, to be introduced by Enid, who's been such a driving force for so long, and to look at all, just in the next few hours, the number of friends of mine, people I love and admire, who are giving talks and advice and wisdom, from David Zuckerman to Kristen Kimball and Mark Gunther, to on and on and on down the list, people talking about every possible important thing. It's, for me, an enormous pleasure, because it's not that often that I get to talk about things that are generally happy, that are generally going the right way. Now, I'm not going to do that the whole morning, I'm afraid, but for a minute, I want you just to think a little bit about how much you've accomplished in even the last decade. It hasn't happened with quite the speed that our brothers and sisters in Egypt managed to make their revolution, but it's happened with pretty lightning speed. I was thinking this morning as I came from Middlebury that it was 10 years ago this year that I taught a little course for a J term at Middlebury on local food production. And I think it might have been the first course like that in any college in the country. And now you cannot get through college in this country without reading Michael Pollan. I don't think there's any way that you can, any place. I remember 5-6 years ago calling up the editor of Gourmet magazine and saying, we're doing this kind of strange thing in our house this year. We're only eating food from the Champlain Valley, nothing else. See if we can get through the year doing it. And she laughed, said, "That's the most insane and crazy thing I've ever heard. You should definitely write a story." Well, 2 years after that, locavore was the new word introduced by the most important word of the year according to Webster's dictionary. Just to have watched all this, not to have done anything to cause it, but just to watch it has been enormous, enormous fun. And last year, the most powerful, the best statistic I've heard in the longest time, the thing that really begins to sum up all your work and make clear that it's now acquiring a kind of real momentum, that it's moving from the fringe to the center. Last year, the USDA said that for the first time in 150 years, the number of farms in America had increased, not decreased. Now, until last year, there's nobody in this room who'd lived in America where farms were increasing. There's nobody whose grandmother or great-grandmother had lived in an America where the number of farms was in. The single most dominant trend across this nation for 150 years had been that steady consolidation and decline of agriculture to the point where less than 1% of Americans were still on the farm. And now that has hit bottom and begun to reverse, and it is an epochal moment. It's like that moment in the late 19th century when the historians announced that the frontier had been closed, but this is kind of the reverse, this new frontier reopening and America resettling in powerful, powerful ways. And the question will be how fast we can make that rebound happen, and we'll get to that question. But before we do, just to say for a second what a good thing it is. And not just that it's a good thing that's happening, but it's a good thing that it's happening. In fact, a vitally important thing that it's happening, because this change in agriculture is one of the most important ways we have to deal with the biggest fight, the biggest problem, the biggest crisis we've ever stumbled into, the thing that will dominate the landscape, the political landscape, the economic landscape, and the landscape of this country and this world for the foreseeable future. And that's the need, the pressing need, to leave behind 250 years of fossil energy and get on to something else. It has to happen. Now, the rise of local agriculture is really important in that respect for two reasons. One, because it can be a real help, not decisive, but important in helping us move off fossil fuel. Agriculture uses a lot of it the way that we do it at the moment, and it doesn't need to. We can get away from the world of the 2,000-mile tomato, and we can get away from the world where we basically use the soils, the rich soils of the Midwest, as a kind of matrix in which to hold plants upright so we can pour oil over them to make them grow, you know. We can get away from that, and it'll help, and we can move toward a healthy agriculture that starts to build soil that, among many other important things, sequesters some of the carbon from the atmosphere that's driving the problems that we face. You only have to go look at some of the farms run by the carbon farmers of America here in Vermont to get some sense of how quickly and how powerfully soil can begin to change and how much that can help. So it's a good thing in that way that it's happening. But probably more importantly and more desperately, it's a good thing because we're going to need small, local, resilient, effective farms in a way that we never have before. I'm going to talk for a minute here about climate change and global warming. And I apologize for it being depressing, and I will do my best to get through it quickly, but it is the most important thing going on, the most important thing that's ever gone on, and so we better think about it as often as we can. I wrote the first book about global warming 22 years ago, a book called The End of Nature. That's about how long we've really known about this problem, except for the tiniest handful of atmospheric physicists. 20 years ago, we knew that we were facing trouble. We knew that we were burning enough coal and gas and oil and pouring enough carbon into the atmosphere to start heating things. We didn't know 20 years ago how fast it would pinch. The story of the last 20 years is it's pinching a lot faster than we thought it would, and on a lot larger scale. I could talk about it all day. My last book, a book called Earth, E-A-A-R-T-H, was an attempt to argue that we were already moving into a kind of new planet, but we get an incredibly powerful, visceral sense of what that planet felt like just in the last year. 2010 was the warmest year on record around the globe. 19 nations set new all-time temperature records. Some of those records were pretty wild. We were on the phone with our 350.org organizers in Pakistan one day in early June, and one of them said, "It's hot here today," which I was surprised to hear him say. It's usually hot in Pakistan, and no one would think to comment on it. He said, "No, it's really hot here today. We just set the new all-time Asia temperature record. It's 129 degrees." I was like, that is hot, you know. I don't think in Ripton we got to 100 degrees this summer, but if we got anywhere close, you can rest assured we were bitching and moaning. You know, add 30 degrees to that for 98% of Pakistanis, subtract all the air conditioning, and then you have some sense of what it is that we're doing. You don't get heat like that without enormous consequences. And we could see wild things happening to the biggest physical systems of the Earth last year. Wild drought and heat wave across central Russia. It had never reached 100 degrees in Moscow. It was 100 degrees in Moscow for 8 days at the beginning of August. You saw the pictures of those fires and the smoke that they created. The Arctic melted apace. There was both the Northwest and the Northeast Passage opened simultaneously. There was a yacht race last summer through water that even a decade ago no one thought human beings would ever be able to navigate. Maybe most profoundly, we saw this string of truly amazing floods around the world. And the reason we saw them is one of the simple brute facts of physics that'll be one of the most important things for the 21st century. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold. Okay? The atmosphere is about 4% moister than it was 4 decades ago on average, which is an enormous change in a basic physical parameter. And what it does is load the dice for deluge and downpour and flooding. And with those dice loaded, you know, one place after another is beginning to crap out. And that's what we saw this past year. Pakistan was the most remarkable example, okay? That area up along the Khyber Pass, which normally sees about 3 feet of rain a year, saw 12 feet of rain in a week at the end of July. That's why the Indus River swelled across Pakistan to the point where about 1/4 of the country was submerged. That's why 6 months later, there's still 4 million homeless people in Pakistan, i.e. 7 times the population of Vermont with no place to be right now because they were flooded out. And that's just one, I mean, in the last 2 months, there have been 6 of these mega flood events around the world. A couple of them have been in places with rich white people, and hence they get covered by the media. Queensland, the best example, and the pictures are truly astonishing. But they've also been happening in the Philippines, in Sri Lanka, in the area, the sort of country around Rio de Janeiro and Brazil, in Vietnam. Just staggering mega flood events, and we will see more of them. I could talk for a very long time about all the effects of climate change, all right? Let's just think for a moment about the effect on agriculture so far. And the effect on agriculture, in some sense, is kind of easy to measure because one of the things that a worldwide grain market does, food market does, it does a lot of bad things, but it does give you a barometer of what supply and demand look like at any given moment. When Russia had that drought, it spooked the Kremlin enough that they suspended all grain exports to the rest of the world. Russia's the 3rd biggest grain exporter on the planet. The price of wheat instantly was up 70%. The Queensland grain harvest was ruined, much of it, and that's contributing to this same kind of steady upward pressure. At the moment, the northern plains of China, the great grain-growing region of China, is in an absolutely epic drought, the biggest in many, many, many decades. If it doesn't rain in the next couple of weeks there, much of that winter grain crop will fail, and if it does, probably the Chinese won't starve because they've got so much money, thanks to us, that they can go out in the world market and buy grain in large quantities. But if they do, it'll send the price so high that many, many, many other places around the world will not be able to deal with that. Already we see those tremors. One of the many contributing factors to what's happened in the Middle East these past weeks has been the rapid run-up in food prices to the point where people can't afford any longer to make dinner. Here's the thing. It would be nice, if somewhat ignoble, to think that we could kind of hole up here in Vermont and do all the good things that y'all are doing and kind of watch the rest of the world go its own unhappy way. But that's not possible. Even were it moral, it's not possible. All the things that I've described so far, the melting of the Arctic and all